Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh, everyone. Welcome. Thank you all for joining us today at the Sikh Coalition Summer Series. The Sikh Coalition Summer Series is a week-long virtual event that has been bringing together community members to learn from one another, discuss important issues, and engage in fun activities. And today we are super excited to be able to welcome Prab and Gurleen. They will be leading out on a session titled Imagining Future Sikh Sangats, a Summer Fireside Chat with two Queer Sikhs. Prabhdeep is a writer, community scholar, and educator. As a sociologist and doctoral candidate at Brown University, Prabhdeep researches how people and communities make knowledge about race and racism and how they can use this knowledge in their lives. They broadly question how colonialism persists within US higher education and specifically how these ideas about race are used in the processes of hiring, promotion, and defining merit in education and academia. Prabhdeep's community work focuses on identifying and fighting how ideologies of white supremacies, anti-queerness, and gender conformity emerge in our lives, both within and outside of the Sikh and American diaspora. They dream of abolitionist presence and futures filled with community libraries. Welcome, Prabh. Next, we have Garlene Core. Garlene Core is a sexual violence prevention educator at MIT. She's a lover of people and our Sikh community. In an attempt to find the community she herself was searching for, she recently organized 2 Queer Sikh virtual meetups. In this process, she has found so many lovely people which she hopes to introduce you to if you too are searching for a queer Sikh community. Follow her at Green Gurleen on Instagram in order to learn more about her events for queer folks and allies. Thank you so much for joining us today, Prabh and Gurleen. We're so excited to have you both. And to the audience, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom right of your screen. And thank you all for joining here. Prabh and Gurleen, I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you, Preeti. So we're gonna get started. I'll just switch my slides. I refuse to make a PowerPoint for this, so we thought we would try something different. We just wanted to start you off with a little bit of our agenda, and here's the fireside chat we promised you. So we're gonna start off with our introduction. I'll tell you a little bit about what we're gonna cover right now. Prabh and I will share a little bit of our stories, then we'll talk about different cultural frameworks, the state of what LGBTQIA plus Sikhs experience today, just what we've come across and studied, and then we'll turn it to you all in terms of what you all can do to support this community. Prabh, did I leave anything out?
No, I think we're good. At the end, you'll be able to, like you said, your turn. You get to ask questions. So just be on the lookout for that.
Yeah, and then a note about our title. So we called it Imagining Future Sikh Sangats. So this is a space where we want to give you information about what queer Sikhs are experiencing so that we can understand the context and use that to dream about what Sikh Sangats we want to create and imagine in the future. So we're hoping that you'll dream alongside us.
And yes, exactly. And part of that is a lot of these conversations tend to focus a lot on sort of teaching terminology, which is important, teaching sort of factoids and things like that, which are also important. We also, because there's such a huge range of ages, a huge range of geographies and attentions, a huge range of sort of like familiarity with these topics and familiarity with Sikhi, we really wanted to we sort of found the intersections of those moments to really be focusing on how is it that you can navigate the world actively without harming LGBTQIA plus folks and communities. So the conversation today, hopefully what you'll be hearing and keeping track of is not only our individual experiences, but we are not spokespeople of any community. We are 2 people who happened to be living our lives. And along the way of living our lives, people decided to make laws to make our lives not as easy as everyone else's, or just not as fair as everyone else's. So we're hoping that this sort of gives you a sense of the different ways that these sort of violences can enter, because there's no singular way that we're all impacted other than by being targeted.
Thank you for sharing that, Bub. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen, and then do you wanna jump into your story while I do that?
Yes. So one of the first things that we wanted to open up with is we often, I think in a lot of conversations around queerness, transness, around gender, what's been sort of helpful is people always want to know, like, are you out to your parents? How did conversations about your gender go with your parents? Like, were your parents modern? Were they westernized? You know, like, what was their upbringing? All these factors around how is it that you have navigated this so far, and made peace, made pain, and all that sort of stuff. So one thing I always like to sort of emphasize early on is that, like, I've met with tons, like, I'm friends with folks, like, we work together, we live together, we experience these things together. And the one thing that is most important around sort of talking about our life experiences, especially when it comes to trans issues and especially when it comes to the Sikh community, is sort of how, like, class has intersected throughout our lives, whether it made us safer or whether it sort of made like able to access services that could protect us, or access services that, if we didn't have them, would engage with like negative mental health implications, or had access to get away from violent situations, right? So in my experience, my family had always been sort of the ones that sort of engaged with Gurlene, and it was later in life, like when I went off to college, that really they started engaging with the local Sikh Sangats at a much higher level. So for me, my experience with sort of like coming out to my parents was almost over a decade ago. Sort of like coming out to them and having these sort of conversations. I don't like the advice that people give where they say it takes time, because it does take time, but it takes time is not advice. It takes time as a matter of life. So one thing that I always try to tell people in sort of like my experience with my family is that it was active. It was something that you have to work towards. So sort of my experiences with my family have really been about not just centering me so that my parents like understand me, but I've always tried to like flip it back. Like, okay, so this is about me, but why do you only care if it's hurting me? Do you only care if the person who's being targeted is your child? Like, I'm not the only one impacted by this. I'm not the only person who this targets and influence, you know, whose life gets impacted by this. So it's my experience with my family after sort of like, you know, my sister has always been very supportive. So getting her and myself and other family and other sisters together to sort of start like decentering myself and trying to really focus this as like a pollination process. That's sort of been my experience in thinking about my journey over time, especially now as I'm slowly approaching my 30s. So I just wanted to like open up with the idea that not only caste and class engage with this to open up and close doors, but it's something that like changes over time. And yeah, it's been very important over the time to actually find people who engage within the community and who engage outside the community as well. I'll pass it to Gurleen.
Thank you, Brad. Hello, we see a screen. Hi. So my story, I don't know, I call myself a baby gay. I came out much more recently. I have a lovely family who is very Punjabi, and that they're also very obsessed with marriage. I remember like coming out to myself and then like calling the like mental health like therapist at school like the next day, because I was like, this is too much. There's no way that I'm going to be able to like handle this truth about myself. And I also needed like so many specific conditions for me to handle this truth about myself. I needed to be like across the country from my family. So this is on a tangent, but for folks who like are considering coming out to them, not to themselves, but to their families and their friends, I think the conditions in which you would do that are very important. For me, distance was good. For some people, financial stability is good. It kind of depends. But I like to share that like it was very difficult, and eventually I did tell my family, and that that was also difficult, but I felt like we had shared language around Sikhi. So I remember saying to my mom, like, take some time, think about it, and like talk to your guru in order to find the answers that you're seeking for. Like, I'm not sure I can give you them. And so I was really glad that we had that shared language with one another. So that's one piece of my story I wanted to share. The other piece is that I grew up in a very, like, I don't know, like doing all of the things with the Sikh community all of the time, sort of space. And so my mom but like held a class at the Punjabi school, worked with other families to create a Sikh camp, was doing lovely Jakarta stuff with the Jakarta movement all throughout. And so when I came out to myself, I know I never questioned my like queerness and my Sikhi. Like, they were never separate things to me. And I feel a lot of privilege for that. I think because I was like, you know what, I was a head counselor for that camp, and I gave them like 6 years of my life doing all of that labor. And I did this for the Jakarta movement, and I did this for the Sunday school. So I like to say I'm very entitled to the Punjabi Sikh community. And I know that not all queer folks feel the same way. So part of my goal in starting this Queer Sikh meetup and whatever work I'm continuing to do is in hopes that other people who want that community, who've been hurt by that community, can find also healing in that and belonging in the community. So we'll continue on forward. Thank you all for listening to that. I'd like to transition us to the sort of different cultural frameworks section of our talk. And so I'm going to ask Prabh a question. We're just going to do this back and forth for you all. So as you've had conversations around queerness with folks in the community, what do you usually talk about?
Yeah, so going off of both what Gurleen and I were talking about in terms of our own journeys, both within and outside the community, one thing that I have found, especially as I've moved between Sikh and non-Sikh communities and engaged in various types of activism on various types of issues, I organize with sex workers, I organize with migrant workers here. So like one thing that's been very interesting that I've learned across all these different sort of like cultural frameworks is that like in our community, we often don't make the distinction between how we got here. And by that, I mean, we all talk about ourselves as immigrants or an immigrant community or a diaspora. But one thing that's been very, very important and sort of touching on what I mentioned earlier that was really important as part of my own journey and navigating this with my parents was that like, we all did not come here for the same reason. We did not come here by choice. Some of us were forced here, some of us fled here, and some of us chose to come here because they had many options and they therefore could choose which one to spend their time with. So I always like to highlight the fact that, I don't like to highlight the fact, I think it's important to highlight the fact that like parts of our community are refugees. And what does that mean in terms of like the services we provide them, the support that we provide them? How do we acknowledge them as part of our community without ostracizing them or without othering them and making them feel as if they're not us? We have folks who came as asylum seekers. We have people who came during the period where the US opened up their immigration quotas from the Asian continent for folks who had access to education, for folks who had access to people with money, right? Like you didn't have to have money, but you may have had access. You had network access. And then there were folks who had only access to the legal, like the formal legal process. So they waited the entire time, didn't have any expedited access. And all these different things impact or have altered the way that people understand what queerness is. I often talk about it as like with my parents, they didn't really have the paradigm. They didn't have the framework to understand what it meant when I said, I like boys. This is how I express myself. You think I'm a man. I am not. Like, what does that mean? Why is Prabh wearing things that don't look like kurte but kind of look like kurte? Why is Prabh painting their nails and things of that sort? To name a few. And what I've noticed is that a lot of times when I spend the time actually getting to know people's histories about how they got here, that's often been something very, very important as sort of like a common touchstone in understanding. I often find that people who have the hardest times actually settling or adjusting to their new life here, or their continued life here, I should say, right? Like they tend to exert a lot more empathy towards folks who feel sort of like outsiders, not as a universal rule, but that's something that I've sort of noticed, is that when I find that connection with people, it's been very, very important, especially within our communities, where coming from South Asia, coming from India, coming from Punjab, to say that one comes from class is the same thing as to say one comes from caste. So that's something that's been very, very important in like the different cultural frameworks of how people sort of understand what a person's supposed to do, right? And that structures how people react. So that's sort of what I've learned in terms of the engaging in conversations with people with very, very different perspectives or histories than my own. How have you navigated that experience? Are there dynamics you've noticed across like maybe generations?
Good question. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, so I like to share the story about when I first started working at my current job in higher education at a university. I was getting used to the sort of like college population, and because of the work I do in sexual violence, like I don't know, there's just like there's often like a lot of queer folks that I'm working with, just because of the topic and whatnot. And so I remember talking to my coworker, and she's like, yeah, Gen Z doesn't like, they don't come out anymore. I was like coming out to myself like not that month, but like in the same 6-month period. So I was offended by that notion, but I thought it was quite interesting that like generationally we've gotten to a point where people in some parts of the country don't have to come out. It's like, oh yeah, I'm dating this person or I'm dating this person, and there's like no reaction to it. It's just the norm. And now with some distance, I'm thinking like, I can say that's actually great. Like that's when we're imagining future Queer Sikh Sangats, like that's maybe a really nice goal to get to. Potentially, I'm sure there's like things that we can problematize with it, but that was powerful to me. And it also made me think about where the Punjabi Sikh community is in relation to that. I think it's still very important for many of us to have to come out and to represent and to share our stories, because there aren't enough of those. I think that's partially why Prabh and I are here today. But at the same time, there's so much labor associated with that. And so this story from my past about the Gen Z kids reminds me of where maybe we can go with all of that. Okay, so now that we've given you a little bit of context across generation, across sort of experience, and the sort of different levels of caste and class that intersect with queerness, we want to talk to you a little bit more about the experiences that some folks might be having. So.
Forgot I was on silence. So yes, thank you. And as you've been talking to people who have been engaging with you across generations and across geographies, what has your engagement with other queer folk been like? What does that look like as you've navigated it? Like, what are the experiences that they're sharing with you that you think would be like valuable for me to know, folks in the space to know, and things of that sort? But within, obviously, disclosure, safety, confidentiality.
Yeah, thank you for that reminder. I think it's been tough. So I put out this event to have like this Queer Sikh meetup. Rob was gracious enough to support me with that event. And I got about 250 people from across the world to respond to this Google form. And in reading through the responses, I mean, I was in such a daze because people had put sort of their life experiences onto this document, and me being me, Scorpio, held all of their emotions and felt super responsible for them. And what people were saying was that they had never met another queer Sikh person in their entire lives. I'd say like a good quarter of them, if not more, had said that. People said that they felt really alone. They said that they had held these two parts of them separate from anywhere from age 12 to age 47. And that was all very hard for me to hear. On the one hand, I was like, I can relate. And on the other hand, it was so much. It was like, there was so much of that. In addition to that, I had people reach out to me and they shared the sort of abuse that they were experiencing from their families about you know, holding checkpoints of, you know, we're going to make a choice on whether we accept you or not. We're going to send you to conversion therapy. We're going to manipulate your emotions, threaten like what you've offered to us about yourselves. And I also talked to folks who just knew that in their lives, there was just no possibility of them ever living their truth in this way. And they were looking for sort of alternative means to kind of continue satisfy their parents' desire for marriage and kids and all of the things, which as someone who has come out to my family, I think, and who wasn't dealing with the not worry about financial security and all of these things. I mean, there's a lot there, and highlighted, I think, the need that our community faces. The one thing I'll add to that is, as a sexual violence prevention educator, I'm always thinking about relationships, and how the different like intersections of our identity creates vulnerability. So we know that in the Punjabi Sikh community, when we have Punjabi women coming over from Punjab, not being able to drive, not being able to access resources, ending up in abusive families, there's a lot that makes it hard to get out of that if getting out is desired. In my own experiences, going from what I identified as a straight person to a queer person, a straight person with a big mouth and who wants to tell everyone about her life, to being interested in people who are women and realizing, wait, who can I tell? Are they out? All of a sudden feeling the restrictions of this identity on me in a way that I had lived my life so openly up to that point. And so thinking about that vulnerability as it intersects with abuse, I think a lot of Punjabi Sikh people who are dating already don't have access to support, but adding the intersection of queerness, I think, makes it even more vulnerable. So, Rob, I'd love to hear from you about what you have learned and heard and seen about the sort of deeper repercussions of like some of these experiences in isolated ways.
Yeah, so I wrote down some statistics to make sure that I wouldn't like forget anything anything important on this matter. So the one thing that I always like to sort of like start off in sort of understanding the larger ways that this works, right? Like thinking about our communities and how isolation and how closeness are often used. And by that I mean like how often, you know, kids are left at Gurdwara for, you know, because that's where a lot of people socialize. And also how like, for me, like people would be very excited to go to school, but schools were often like a place of harm for me, right? Same for Gurdwara. Like to this day, going to Gurdwara is still like painful for me. And I have to remind myself that I'm here for the Guru and not for all these other people who make things so difficult. And then you add on to that sort of the reckoning that's happening at all, like in different parts of our community all over around sexual violence and predators that are enabled by our community, and for, you know, like figuring out what that conversation looks like. But the thing that I want to sort of highlight in terms of like the intersection here is like what you sort of said, is that like a lot of the people who are being targeted by predators or who are like put into these precarious situations are often not out themselves, or are in situations where they're navigating their own identity, they're navigating their own life experiences, and then this violence happens, right? So I wanted to make like both the connection about like, you know, it's not like there's sexual violence, like you were mentioning, happens a lot. And also it's not happening only to straight people or only to cisgender people, right? And like you were saying, how that manifests for queer and trans people is actually, it can be sometimes more of a magnification of those sorts of things. So for example, a lot of straight people will take for granted the fact that they have a home, if they have a home, or that their family won't kick them out unless maybe you come back. I don't know. What do straight people get kicked out of houses for? I don't know. So for me, that's something that I remember when I was trying to come out to my parents, my biggest fear was, are they going to kick me out, right? And I highlight that because they did not, which was not something that I knew that I could count on, but they did not. And ever since then, homelessness and houselessness has always been one sort of like quote unquote deeper repercussion that I like to highlight, because LGBTQ youth do not magically become unhoused, right? Like, we become unhoused because our families kick us out, which means that people in this room, your friends, people that you spend langar with, people that you have spent birthday parties with, are sites of violence for queer people, right? And that is the sort of like the connection about how intimate partner violence, domestic violence, all of that sort of gets magnified in these sorts of dynamics, because we also don't have then often an outlet to seek support for within the community, because we're often pathologized as being sexual deviant creatures. So for example, I want to make sure I did not get this wrong. In a Williams Institute study where they were studying houselessness among youth, what they found was that among houseless youth, 40% identified as part of the LGBTQ plus community. Of those who did drop-ins at centers, 43% were LGBTQ youth. Of outreach done by unhoused coordinators for services, 30% of the people that they were able to outreach to through the streets or while on the streets were LGBTQ youth. 30% of people going to housing services as youth are identified as part of the LGBTQ community. So what you're starting to see here is that there's a magnification where the home as a site of violence for a lot of people is a particular site of violence, and that is why so many queer people, we often reject or question the nuclear family model that's often like presented as like the go-to and the only way. And because of that, a lot of Sikhs will then say, well, you're deviant because you don't believe in like married with one other person and then having a nuclear family with that. Whereas what we're trying to just say is families in the structure that you want us to live in have been nothing but violent towards our life for a lot of us. So why would we jump into that? And that sort of disconnect never happens. And just to sort of round out on this point about precarity, when folks are put into precarious conditions, they often, especially as youth or as adolescent or as young adults, don't have access to job opportunities. So they find the jobs and occupations that they can. This is something that I find in a lot of sort of the grassroots work that I do here in Rhode Island, right? So in New York, they're recently talking about repealing the Walking While Trans bill. Well, that's a good thing to do. What they may not be telling you is actually that bill that they're trying to repeal is a statute that puts loitering and prostitution in the same violation. And as a result, who do you think that the policing is going to use that statute on? You don't have to think about it. I have the stats for you. In 2018, there was a 120% increase in street arrests under this statute. 47% of those arrests were concentrated in the Bronx, which is a primarily Black and Latinx and working class community. Of those arrests, 91% were Black and Latinx people, primarily women, inclusive of trans women. So what I'm trying to paint here in the deeper repercussions is that the moment that you only see us as deviant simply for existing, whether you understand us or not is not the point. The fact is the moment that you associate deviance and sexual promiscuity, regardless of whatever your rationale is, with all queer people, which is what we call homophobia, or anti-queerness or anti-transness, that has a much larger, what we call structural and societal implication. And it only compounds on the things that we've already talked about so far. So yeah, I know I've sort of laid a lot of things out there for folks to process, but the main point to take away here is that what you do to the person next to you has implications on our lives, because the family, that nuclear unit, is the site of a lot of violence for us.
I think what's so powerful about what Breb is talking about is that we can all connect with it. I mean, whether or not you identify as LGBTQIA+ or not, security, financial security, having a home to go to, those are having friends to talk to about not great situations that you might be in, family to rely on. Those are privileges that we all hold. And sometimes it can be hard to see them. And I think it's so powerful that you remind us that not everyone gets access to those privileges and should. Those are rights. They're not privileges, those are rights. To have a house, a safe house, have people that you can go to. So thank you for diving in deeper with us to help us understand why it's not just that, you know, one person feels alone, or that one person doesn't have someone to talk to, or one person hasn't connected pieces of their identity. There's real vulnerability there with real repercussions.
Exactly. Yeah, go ahead, sorry.
Well, no, you go. I was going to transition us, so you finish your thought.
No, I was just going to say, like, especially in the last 40 years, where basically anything that's considered a human right gets translated into a privilege, it's really important to keep in mind what are actual human rights. Like, I can't believe, but I'm still shocked that I have to convince people that housing is a right that every human should have. Like, the safety and security of a home, the safety and security of being able to go to the doctor without having to worry about getting a bill that you may not be able to pay that then gets passed on to your family after death. You know, like, these are things that we think about. So when people say that healthcare, housing, job security are not queer or trans issues, I always have to question them of like, you need to define to me what you think is an issue.
Yes. Very good reframe between privilege and rights. And I can imagine hearing this all and thinking, you know, what's my role in it as someone who maybe is straight, and what can I do? Or maybe who is queer and holds more privilege, or is getting all of those rights or more of those rights. So at this point, Preeti, we're going to invite people to put things into the chat. The question that we're going to start to answer, and we'll hope to get some answers from you, are what can you do? Like, how can you be supportive to the LGBTQIA plus Sikh community? So Prabh, you want to get us started, and I'll chime in?
Yeah, so what are some things that we could do? So like, we have a whole list of things that we came up with, and I'm just looking at it, I'm just like, oh, interesting. So one thing, especially in our community, right, that we can sort of talk around is, what are the things that we do that are specifically related to gender? Like, whether it's wedding practices, whether it's birth announcements, whether it's celebration of what we think that our child is going to be born as, which I always like to say, good luck guessing, because I gave my parents a nice surprise halfway through my life. So good luck. I wouldn't invest too much, is all I would say. But yeah, so like, sort of things around that of like, you know, is the proper response to people giving laddu when a male is born to give a different colored laddu when a non-male is born? Why aren't we just giving single laddus to everyone, regardless? And what is this, you know, like, we have a history of a moment of highlighting, yes, femicide happens in our community, so there's an importance to this. And I think the flip side that we're offering to you is, how do you include that as part of the conversation rather than as a roadblock of trying to, like, we're trapping ourselves back into this. And at the same time, we need to acknowledge, how do we move ahead from this? Which is not an easy thing to do, but that's something to think about. We leave with all of you all to think about, is like, what is gender doing for you? How do you use it? And it doesn't need to be used there.
Yes, I think about moments, I mean, small things. Like, I think about moments when people asked me who I was dating and like felt so constricted by that question, and like just said, I don't know what I would do, but like, nothing, I don't know, don't ask me anything ever again. Like, that was my awkward response, but it was coming out of like, how do I tell you this like thing and you're assuming that I want to be dating a guy at this exact moment. So I think things in language, when we're why not keep things neutral? It might feel like, I don't know, why would I do that? But it might actually open up so much for your friends and family members to be authentic with yourself. People pick up on subtle cues. We make choices every day about who to share which pieces about ourselves with who in our life. And it's based off of how much we know that they're going to listen to us, how much they're going to question us if we do end up sharing our truths. So those subtle cues about being gender inclusive, I know I was looking out for that, and like ended up going to those people first when I needed support. Yeah.
And not the only other thing, but one other thing that I would add that's sort of missing in what we've said so far is we talked a lot about sort of the structures that, that impact, sort of give people access to things and like withhold access to things. One really important one is healthcare. And by that, I mean, especially for folks in the trans community, like we don't all do the same things. We don't all have the same needs, and we have different needs, but unable to access them. So one real thing that folks can do is actually push for healthcare coverage, push for these other things that we mentioned are actually human rights. Like that is a very tangible way that straight people in that spaces where they're able to be straight and don't have to worry or think twice about that identity should be using that aspect of their identity to insert and push. Does, like, how many of you know whether or not your employer offers gender confirmation or gender affirmation services? Like, is that covered under your company's policy? You know, are you opening, is like in your school, in my school, there was like one GSA, and now it seems like no one needs GSAs anymore, but there's still bullying going on. So like, you know, what are you doing are you only talking about queer issues or trans issues around queer and trans people? Because we don't need to hear it. We know it, we live it. We need you to tell your friends who won't talk to us to stop dehumanizing us, right? So like that is a very important sort of aspect of like it's a very sort of simple switch, but the problem is you have to learn it, right? Like you can't just be coming to these talking sessions because we won't be able to tell you everything you need to know. So there is that's an active part of like, how many of you have actually Googled or read about the history of how queer and trans people were institutionalized through the medical system? And now we have to look at the medical system for like affirmation. Like the way I describe it is like, you told us that we were wrong and now you're telling us that you can come help us. So like sort of thinking about the institutions that you're in and like, in what ways are they already excluding people? Like there are resources online about doing assessments of just like, you know, getting an idea of like what the terrain is around policy and culture. So those sorts of things, like be proactive about them and don't speak over queer or trans people, but like work with them and maybe show to them that you are worthy of their trust, because trust is a big thing. It's scary to be, especially these days, to be working and be working with people when they have the right to hate openly and violently.
I'd love to share just like a little tiny story about misinformation. Correcting misinformation is like the takeaway. So when I came out to my family, I also then, it was like fine. It was fine for a year, and then I came out on Instagram, and then it was not fine because then all the aunties and uncles found out. And I remember like one family coming and sitting down with my family and saying to my parents like, Gurleen is lost. She's lost, and we're gonna help her find her way. And it was terrible. I was like at a retreat, so I couldn't talk to my mom for like 3 days, and I couldn't like explain to her that for 50 years, you've been fed misinformation about what it means to be queer or trans. And now someone is coming to you and you're vulnerable as a parent of a queer child, and you have no education of your own to combat that. So if someone's coming to you saying, your daughter is lost, you're gonna believe that your daughter is lost. And so, I don't know, I mean, and that was just like that was like a small tidbit of like the misinformation that exists out there. So I do think we need like widespread education for all folks in our community to be able to combat some of that. So I'm seeing a lot of questions coming into the chat. You think it's a good time to transition?
Yeah, so bear with us as we sort of like look through these. Take a moment. We love quiet time. So take this moment to maybe reflect. And how about this? How about on a sheet of paper or a text or something, text a friend something you learned, or text yourself a commitment of something new you're gonna do from basically what you've learned as we read these questions.
Actually, Rob, I'm ready with the first one.
Go for it.
Yeah. So, okay, this first question, I'm just going to summarize it. It's about timeline. Like, do you think that we could have an openness to the LGBTQ community in the next decade, or is it going to take longer than the decade? What do you think, Bob?
Is it going to take longer than a decade for the Anand Karj? I think, I mean,
Just
people have,
openness, not
uh,
openness within
sorry,
unguard.
I was like, I was reading another question, so I was like, oh,
I was like,
I
don't
was like,
jump
that's
ahead.
it. An openness. Well, I think at the end of the day, like, we're gonna fight for space in Gurdwara just to be like human and to be able to do what we want, like while we're there, just like everyone else. Do I think there's openness in the next 10 years? I mean, part of it's going to depend on how much of the earth is left in 10 years. Like, I'm like,
Yes.
I feel like a lot of these conversations, like, we forget that like climate change is real, climate change is happening. So these questions, like, that's why I was like, urgency is really like not just, will there be openness? The question is, will you have built space for us? That's the actual question. So like, it's entirely possible. We could have space in 2 years. We could have space in a year and there'd be openness. But at the end of the day, there's more straight people than there are of us, right? Which is why we're so loud, because with a snap of your finger, you could elicit violence on all of us. So it really falls, the question about openness is really like, what work do you want to do? Have you had a conversation? Have you hosted like among the youth? Are all the Gurdwara committees still the same people who were there 2 decades ago? Those are all sort of indications about whether or not, like, are the youth involved in governance? Like, is there shared governance of the Gurdwara like they're supposed to be? Like, those are the sort of things that will determine whether or not there's openness 10 years from now, right? So, yeah.
Yes, and we can jump to the Nungarj question next if you want to read that. I would also add that there are very open people in our community right now. I was just talking to someone who's like in their early 20s about their parents' reaction to them coming out. And I mean, the whole story was shocking. I think there was like a high five involved, like it was just like so nonchalant, like, and I don't know if you guys can hear the thunder outside my window, but it was like very, very nice. And I think there was even a sort of like, thank you for giving me time to process from the parents, which also shocked me. I was like, what? I cannot imagine. But those stories exist. And I think those parents don't feel comfortable coming out to the rest of the Sangha, sharing how open they are, but there are stories of openness that I think are also important to remind ourselves of today. Yeah.
And I'm actually going to merge the Nungarj question with another one, because I think they're related. So someone asked, and I'm also, this is how I feel. The Lama are some of my favorite shabads to actually like, listen to. So the fact that like, I echo what this person is saying about like going to current like weddings is actually quite like painful. So like, I usually just try to make it for literally the Nungarj and then I leave. Because so many of the things that are part of it, as this question says, yeah, a lot of it is actually asking straight queer people or trans people to engage in an institution that you have yet to open for us. So like, I think people need to like, I mean, the phrase is sit with that. Like, you're asking someone to like help and do service and take part in your joy while also being fully aware that they are not allowed to you would not be allowed to take part in their joy in the same way, right? So in terms of like queer Nungarj, I think that honestly, the reason that there's such a struggle around it is because we don't have conversations about heterosexual Nungarjs. Like, we don't, like, how many of you know how to be married? We give advice after the Nungarj, but like someone goes up to the podium to talk about what they're supposed to do in life, right? And it's like, I'm sorry, this conversation should have started ages ago. And if you're trying to give spiritual guidance about this, like, I think it's an entire abdication of what the Nungarj is supposed to be. So when we have conversations about like, oh, can queer, LGBTQ folks, queer and trans people have Nungarjs, I'm still waiting for like heterosexuals to have an actual Nungarj. Like, they're really just doing a ritual. Like, most of them do not commit to the vow, like the vow to the guru that they make. So to me, like, the Nungarj is always there. You have the guru. So like, I think really it's a problem with heterosexual Nungarjs. That's a hurdle to queer and trans Nungarjs, because like, I don't want to be part of that institution that the way that you do it. Like, it seems violent. And if it's not violent, you need to change it. And because we're not allowed to engage in it, that's really, again, people keep on asking, what are things that we can do? Literally, the institutions that you're upholding are the things that you can do, right? So when people say, like, your straight ally friends should not be asking you to take part in things that if they value you as a queer or trans person, they should not be asking you to do things that compromise your identity, right? You would never ask someone who is a fierce and devoted feminist to go to a marriage of like two misogynists. Like, it just doesn't make sense. Like, I had to think, like, what does that look like? You have to work to make that happen, right? So yeah, that's sort of my long-winded question around Unguard. Just so whoever wants them should have them. I just think, like, if we're talking about like inclusion and change, we should talk about what the problem is. And the problem isn't that we're queer or trans. The problem is straight people have not learned how to do an Unguard properly.
I think the quote from today's session is going to be, how many of you even know how to be married? Prabhdeep, singh, kehal.
It'll send whoever's on the Twitters and the Instagrams after me, but that's fine.
I do want to say there are folks who have had an Unguard, and I'm one of those who dreams of an Unguard. So you're all invited when that happens. Yeah.
Maybe you could answer aspects of that. What would it look like as a support for you? And like, there was a question from someone who's thinking about high school, right? So like, how do youth support us? How do they support their fellow queer and trans people? How are you seeing things and conversations you're having about like actual things that people can do?
Oh,
yeah, I'm asking you. I'd like merging questions for you.
Ooh, there's 5 questions. That's cool. Well, I don't know. When I think about the Unguard, I think about 2 souls uniting, and I could be wrong in that, but that feels like all the justification I need. I don't know. I've done all of the, like, what would it look like to reimagine like each piece of tradition and make it queer friendly and queer inclusive. And one of my goals in the sort of like larger project of like the Queer Sikh meetup is to make sure that as people are having queer and Unguards, we're getting those images out, because I think it's really validating. When we can't see ourselves in media, it feels like we don't exist. So that's just like some of what comes up for myself.
Yeah, and sorry, I never meant to dismiss people who value, like, the Guru sends someone to me to be an Unguard with, watch out, but otherwise, until then, I'm chilling.
Where do you want to take us next, Prab?
There was a question that someone asked that they were about to go into high school. So I really do want to answer this question. They were saying they were going into high school and they wanted to know how to support their queer and trans friends. And I think that's a very important question, because I love the fact that youth are thinking about this so early, right? Whereas like a lot of people in my generation did not start thinking about this until 2 months ago. So in school contexts, I'm going to say some of the biggest sources of violence, obviously, are your friends, so peer networks. So make sure that you're actually standing up for your friend anytime that you think they have communicated hurt, or anytime you think that they may be hurting. Just like check in. It's the same thing that you would do with any sort of friend. The difference is, and I often say that like, I'm not queer, you made me queer, or you made me gay, right? And by that, people really freak out. But it's not a complicated idea. What I mean by it is that, like, it is my mannerisms, the way that I engage with the world, that other people start noticing that I'm gay, or that I'm queer, or that I'm not normal, right? Or as I lovely like to call myself, I'm a wonderful trans non-binary person. But sort of thinking about that, and like, that means the sources of violence are your teachers. It means it's the principal. It means that it's if you're in a heavily policed school. So I know a lot of Sikh communities have been advocating for like support around bullying. And like, especially right now with the movement for Black Lives going on, we have to think about what it means to be calling in police, what it means to be relying on them to be our defenders, when we know how policing results in the incarceration of Black youth and low-income youth, or youth from families with low income. So in sort of like how to support your friends who are going through it, really it's about creating the space for them. Like, you should be their sangat, right? And a sangat means you are there for them spiritually, emotionally, you are there for them physically when they need someone to like fight or defend them. So it's like, those are the sort of tangible things you can do. But also start thinking about like, ask them like, do you need something? Like, should I make a club for you? Would that, like, can I take something off of your like workload? Or like, you know, there's a lot of things that kids these days are like navigating. Like they see the world ending, so there's an existential crisis. They're realizing they're gay and that the world may not support them. There's that, you know, like there's a pandemic going on. There's a lot of crises going on that have been going on. They're just noticeable now. So if you're trying to support people, like think tangibly, like, yeah, think tangibly around sort of like what they need. Center them and their needs. I'll pass off the next question to Gurleen.
All right, I did some digging and I've got the high school question right here copied below. So it says, sometimes we may have friends in our surroundings that might not be openly queer or maybe fighting the struggle of coming out on their own. I don't want them to feel like they're alone. How can we recognize their queerness and how do we make sure they feel like they're not alone? How do I support them going into high school, so in the school environment? So I'll start us off, and Brev, if you want to add to it, you can add after. I like to tell people I'm an introvert, and I very carefully choose who I'm going to share pieces of myself with. And I choose very carefully because I mean, I don't know, like a lot of people, I feel like I've told people things and I've been hurt by their response. And so what usually hurts me is like when I offer some piece about myself and then like someone's on their phone or like someone's like not listening, or someone like interjects with a story of their own, which I'm also guilty of, so it's okay. But if you're a high school student, I mean, you know what? I think if you're asking this question, you probably have all the right answers already, because your heart and soul is like so kind that you're like trying to like proactively figure out how to be supportive. So you've got all the tools in you already. I would probably say if you're being a kind listener, I think that's really 90% of it. I'd add to that. Sometimes it's nice to be the person who's bringing up the thing. So just like Brev was saying, that person doesn't have to do the labor of like always like being like, can we talk about this thing? And then the third I would say is about curiosity. So curiosity is part of the human condition, which is really great. And sometimes you don't always have to ask to understand. You can ask for that person to be heard and listen to, but like if you're like, ooh, I wonder about like how they feel about this thing, like you don't have to ask that question. Hold on to that and save that for like, I don't know, your straight friends or like Google or something else. But don't use them as like a dictionary of like all of the knowledge in the world around queerness, because they're just trying to figure it out. So I hope those are some helpful tips.
And the only thing I'll add to that is, usually I'm not one to like plug institutional information. But the American Psychological Association is making up for their bad Gadma, and they have a ton of resources for principals, for teachers, for parents, and for friends that already define these terms in a sort of like helpful way. I wouldn't print out the definitions and like swear by them, but they give you enough to work off of. But they give you guidance around like how do you work with, how do you think about being supportive if you are a principal or if you are a teacher, and vice versa. How are you as a parent, right? Like if I can Google these resources, I promise you they exist. And then just this other question, someone asked me if I could elaborate on what is gender doing and what did I mean by that? Yes, so I literally mean by that is ask yourself, why is it important to me to say that I'm a man? It's not a critical question, like it's an exploratory question, right? Our Barney is full of them, like back and forth, question and answer between Guruji and someone. So like, ask yourself, what does being a man, why does that matter to me? Why does being a woman matter to me? You will end up with answers that may surprise you. You'll end up with answers that are like, I know for some people who I've talked to who are super, super supportive of trans people, whenever I sort of say like we need to free ourselves from this obsession with biological determinism, which means that men and women are determined solely by their like chromosomes or by their genitalia and things of that sort, despite the huge amount of diversity in like literally in genetics around that same question. They often push back, like there is like I mentioned earlier, there's a history of femicide in our community. So there's an element that they're trying to name, right? And what they do is that they unintentionally place that on the burden of trans people, and specifically trans women, as if they are trying to deny the existence that patriarchy happens and that patriarchy results in femicide, right? And what I say to them in terms of answering the question, what does gender do for you? I say, is your problem with trans women or is your problem with patriarchy? Like, why are you fighting your battle of patriarchy on trans women's bodies? So that's sort of what I mean about what does gender do to you? Because when that person started asking themselves, what does it mean for me to like be a woman? What they ended up finding was like that was what was that among other things. But all the other things were not things that like determined their gender or anything like that. But that was the history. That was the cultural memory that they wanted to not lose. And I was like, that's not trans women, right? That's not trans people. So that's sort of what I mean of like, ask yourself that question. Because I ask myself, what does it mean to be non-binary all the time? And my answers change. It's wonderful. And I think, you know, like Guruji has the same conversation literally hundreds of times. And it seems like Guruji does not get bored with asking the same question in different ways and giving the same answer. So I don't know why we are, right? Like, let us do that exploration.
That reminds me of like my relationship to Japji Sahib, how like reading 140 like meant nothing at some point, and then coming back to it 5 years, I was like, wait a minute, and then coming back to it 10 years later, I was like, wait a minute. Gender feels very similar, and I'm very much on a similar journey. So I know we're like very much out of time, but I do want to end us with this question from someone who said, do you have specific examples from Sikhi that can be used as we talk about these topics to our parents or grandparents?
Can I answer a very short question before I forget, since that's a good question and this is a short one?
Yeah, just if anyone needs to head off, we appreciate you for showing up and feel free to reach out as needed. So go ahead, Brem.
It's not homophobic to write women with an X. What I would caution is people who use women with a Y. It has a very specific history with the Y that started off first as sort of a affirmation of womanhood that then transformed into an exclusion of trans women. So usually people who use the Y intentionally from history are using it as a way to assert biological woman. So I have yet to hear of any sort of discourse or conversation around women with an X being homophobic. But again, ask yourself, what are you trying to accomplish with what you're trying to do with that, right? So that's all. I'll pass it to you back.
Well, I mean, I can get us started, but I would love if anyone has answers for them to type up. Like, this is one of the resources I do want to help create for the community, like queer affirming, like Sikh concepts or Sikh history. There's a great organization in the UK called Sarbat, and it's based off of the principle Sarbat Tapala. And like, I think Prabh has said this really powerfully to me, that like, it's not about like understanding, it's about accepting and respecting. And so like, even if we never folks can never understand the trans experience or like welcome it or the queer experience, we still have Sarbat Tapala, which feels like a really important grounding that like the best for all people, no matter what. So that's the one I immediately think about. Rob, is there anything that comes to mind for you?
From Barney about, sorry, I missed the end of the question specifically.
Just like, if you're a straight person talking to your parents, trying to correct the misinformation using Sikh principles,
Yes.
It could be history too. I think history is really powerful too. Yeah.
So yes, 2 points, and I'll be brief because I have a habit of not being brief. One is I want people to sort of think about sort of something that we mentioned throughout the conversation, but didn't specifically say, is that one form of violence that happens today still is that queer people are getting married in opposite sex people in order to not either deal with violence, you don't feel supported in the conversation. So I say that because in terms of thinking about our history, that means a lot of the Kaurs that we celebrate, a good chunk of them are probably like not or queer. A bunch of the Kaurs that we celebrate may today use the term trans in order to describe their experience, right? But we don't know. Those weren't questions, those weren't topics, those weren't things that they discussed, right? So that's one thing in terms of Sikh history. And the second one, this is a Shabbat I use all the time. I recently wrote a piece on it, but it's a shabad that's about Bhagat Namdev Ji and how the Brahmins would not let him enter the temple because he was of lower caste. He was, I forget which, but I believe it was untouchable Dalit in some outside the caste hierarchy. And the Brahmins refused to let him enter. And Bhagat Ji cried out to Guruji and said, look at the people, look at what they've done, they won't let me come to you. And then in the final line of the Shabad, Guruji takes the temple and turns it around from the Brahmins and turns it to Bhagat Ji. So to me, what I sit with that story, with that Shabad, is that you can say you're Guru Da Chela all you want, but the moment that you act in a way that denies the existence or the ability of someone else to access the Guru, the actual translation is the Guru's glory recedes from you. So for me, sort of in like thinking about that, a lot of people will say that they're Sikh and they want Sikh principles, but then you tell them that and all of a sudden they get very uncomfortable and they're like, you're just twisting the words. You're just trying to make it work for what you want. And I sit there and I'm like, Guruji literally said when people who call themselves their devotees say that there are contradictions, Guruji literally cleans the contradiction. So like, I feel like people need to, like, again, sit with that and figure out what that means for them.
I think that's a really powerful story and a great place to end. Thank you, everyone. I was waiting for Preeti to show up. I thought it would just happen magically. There was a delay in our telepathic connection.
No, not a problem at all. To the audience, thank you so much for joining us today. There was a lot of positive feedback, Garlene and Prabha. I know that it may be difficult for you to keep up with the conversation and the chat, but there has been so much appreciation and love for the both of you. So a special thank you to Garlene and Prabha for sharing their time, their stories, their experiences with us. It was an amazing conversation. And as I said, the chat has been filled with positivity and so much appreciation and love from all over the States and maybe all over the world too. I can't check where everyone is from. But obviously there's a lot of work to do in our community to make sure that we're making spaces safe for everyone. And this session was super insightful for me, and I know I learned a lot, and it seems like the audience has also learned a lot, and they've taken a lot of great tips from both of you. So thank you for your time, and thank you so much for sharing. And to the audience, if you have any further questions or want to connect with our speakers, you can do so at Gurleen's Instagram, which is at Green Gurleen. And Prab can be reached at prabhdeep@gmail.com. Prab, do I have that right?
I was trying to show it, but
thumbs up. Okay, awesome. So yes, I know there were a lot of questions that were not answered, and a lot of advice seekers here as well. So if you have any additional comments or questions, you can reach Gurleen at, again, Instagram at Green Gurleen, and Prab can be reached at prabhdeep@gmail.com. And again, thank you so much for attending this session. Thank you, Gurleen and Prab. And just as a reminder, the Sikh Coalition Summer Series is continuing until Saturday evening. So if you enjoyed this session, we have a lot of other sessions as well we hope that you would enjoy. You can register at sikhcoalition.org/summer series, and we hope we see you again this week. Thanks.
Do it! Thank you. Bye, y'all.
Thanks, Prabha. Thank you so much for coming in. Bye, everyone.